Hello, I'm Peter Herbert from Insight Training and welcome to today's webinar, Running the 21st Century Practice. It's occurred to us that running a practice in the 21st century is somewhat challenging. In this internet age, I guess clients may well be more self-sufficient in many respects, and that in terms of firms brings in different needs in terms of skill set and different sorts of regulatory pressures. What we're going to do over the next 40 minutes or so is talk about how some of those actually apply. Joining me on today's session is Nikki Clough, my business partner and fellow director of Insight Training. Nikki is also a chartered accountant and she leads for us on business skills training. Let me start off by just chatting you through some of the logistical aspects of our Adobe Connect webinar platform. So you'll see in the resources box, you've got the slides that accompany the webinar, so feel free to download those at will. You've also got a reading list, so one or two of the things we'll talk about during the session, there's some additional reading and articles that may be of interest, so do access that and again download those documents as you see fit. You've also got the Q&A box there in the screen, so if you have any questions or comments as we work our way through, do drop those comments or questions into the Q&A box. And if it's to do with the topic we're covering off early on, do populate the question and answer box as the question occurs to you, don't leave it all till the end. And we'll be really keen at the end of this session to take a few questions. And if we don't get around to your question, we'll email you back and perhaps have a dialogue offline. But always keen to make these sessions interactive, so feel free to actually ask any questions you want. No one else can see who's put a question in the question and answer box, so don't fear any problem in terms of people being aware of who's put the question in. Absolutely anonymous, but really good for us to get some queries. So obviously, if you want to participate in that way, we'd be really happy for you to do so. I draw your attention to our disclaimer and copyright, which is summarised on this slide. Okay, so what we're going to do in the session, a general introduction really in terms of what we might refer to as the Brave New World. We're then going to talk about some specific aspects in relation to tone at the top within practices, some very specific detail around managing risk, and then we're going to finish off with some people management issues to finish off the session. Okay, so it's the age of artificial intelligence, cloud computing, data analytics, MTD, and I guess if software and systems are configured in a way where clients can undertake more simple tasks themselves, I guess for staff within firms, it then becomes more about adding value and more about really playing that trusted business advisor role. And that, I guess, is the challenge in the 21st century. In terms, I suppose, of firms, it's therefore thinking about, do your staff have the competencies to add value in the way that clients need? And it's developing those competencies, I guess, within your people. We're just mindful that maybe for those of us that have perhaps over the years in a practice role, help clients in terms of the accounts preparation process from end to end, from bookkeeping all the way through to statutory accounts production. These days, perhaps staff do not have that on-the-job experience to gain the commercial acumen that they might need to be a trusted business advisor, and therefore it's perhaps about finding different ways of imparting those sort of skills. What we observe certainly, I think, in terms of insight is that within practices, those that really stand out are people that have within firms good interpersonal skills, and Nikki will talk about a few of those more sort of business skills aspects toward the end of her session. And then from a regulatory risk point of view, I suppose the regulatory pressures are the same as they ever would be, but they would manifest themselves in different ways these days based on the sort of issues that the 21st century practice would actually have to face. One of the things that I talk about quite a lot on the practice regulation updates that I run, do a bit of a trawl through the pages of Economia and try and get a sense of perhaps what areas of regulation within firms people most often get fined by professional bodies for a failure to comply. And these are the sort of the top 5 from our recent audit based on looking at the Economia articles or pages over the last year or so. One or two of these, I suppose, are pretty self-evident, but just if I could perhaps drill down on one or two of them in a bit more detail. So failure to follow the ethical code. I guess the challenge can be in firms, if you are having to work hard to chase advisory work, sometimes might you perhaps, fall the wrong outside of the line in terms of how you approach that sort of business development, and that's perhaps considered as being unethical. One particular thing that I've seen crop up in economy a few times of late, where people have been kind of wrapped on the knuckles, is as a result of, I suppose, irresponsible use of social media, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, that sort of thing. What I'm certainly talking about on the practice regulation updates at the current time is that when firms employ, a significant number of staff, it's perhaps having some protocol in that area, because certainly based on those disciplinary cases, there have been instances where people have actually, not done the right thing, and therefore the professional body's taken quite a dim view. Clearly a very peculiar issue to the current age, but one that I think links in quite nicely there with ethics. Non-compliance with the new money laundering regulations. And one of the things I've always said recently around AML compliance is that I think back in the day, before the 2017 regulations came in, it was always going to be a high risk proposition when you did not meet the client face to face. The 2017 regulations removed that, and you might therefore need to conclude when you don't meet the client face to face, it's normal level of risk, because that, I guess, these days is kind of the nature of the beast. You may not always, meet the client face to face in this internet age. But I think really important to think about in the context of AML compliance, doing appropriate risk assessments, thinking about why a particular client represents a high level of risk, and then doing the verification checks that you need to do. And although it's not nailed on imperative that you conclude that a client you've not met face to face is high risk, you might conclude that anyway, because what are you taking on trust by not meeting them? I do think compliance with the AML regime is burdensome for firms and their staff, but I think it's really important to do, really important to respect those regulations, and ultimately it will protect you more than anything else if you comply in the way that you need to. We'll talk about a little bit later on in the webinar in the context of negligent tax advice, things like professional indemnity cover and letter of engagement wording, and those sorts of devices you can actually utilise quite effectively to minimise risk. One bit of legislation just to sort of flag up there in the context of tax, which I think is currently quite topical, is in the context of the Criminal Finances Act 2017, the relatively new offence for corporate tax evasion, where if someone in a firm helps a client evade tax, they're clearly bound to rights. But if the firm did not have adequate controls in place that prevented that taking place, the firm itself can be liable for an unlimited fine. Now, all I'm seeing really in that particular context currently, I do think in smaller firms that perhaps get involved in more simple, more straightforward tax compliance work, one would imagine not a massively risky area, but I think two really key things here. First of all, I think in all firms that employ staff, very important to think about having some sort of procedure, some sort of protocol in place, so people at least know what that basic rule is all about. And I put a link in the supporting materials, a very good resource on the Institute website that will help you with that. I am finding that, based on discussions with delegates of late, I was talking to a gentleman on a conference last week that was saying that in their practice they've done a very good audit of exactly what tax work they do for clients and how they advise, and it's been quite revealing and quite illuminating to do that audit. And I think some of the staff involved in the regulatory side of things were perhaps not quite aware of what the firm was actually doing. And that audit again has revealed for them, actually, do we want to be providing this sort of advice? And if we do, making those involved really clear, where the markers are and what they need to do to ensure they're in no way, shape or form falling foul of this sort of corporate tax evasion offence regime. I think in the first year, the revenue have taken a fairly light touch approach to regulation in that area. It may be that going forward, they're going to sort of ramp things up. And if they do think people are not following the rules as they should do and are actually helping clients evade tax more than ever, they're going to take a really, really dim view. So do be aware of the guidance there on the Institute website and share that and think about protocol in that area. That I think is quite key. Client monies regs, not a lot to say on that. That's the fifth in the list of the top five. I get a sense that these days the banks are very much putting the shutters up and preventing hardened criminals using the banking system to launder the proceeds of crime. They're having to therefore look, I suppose, in the current era for different ways of trying to launder their dirty money. Very important to be aware, therefore, you've got to be very careful, I think, in a firm about what use you let people make of your client monies account. It's a very sort of hot area, I think, in terms of regulation. And you may be aware that Client Monies Regulation 8A came out a couple of years ago that said that you can only let clients use your client monies account specifically in the context of services that you're providing. So we're doing client monies reviews for firms who always say, in relation to monies washing through that client monies account, show me the letter of engagement that particular transaction relates to, and if there isn't one, you're not complying with 8A and you're not going to be in a good place. Again, that's another one I think currently to be mindful of when you do operate a client monies account. So there's a few bits of bad news, perhaps in a way, in the kind of some of those disciplinary aspects. But again, it does link into sort of current and topical issues in the 21st century. What I'm now going to do is hand over to Nikki, and she's going to talk about some other aspects, notably tone at the top.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pete. Thank you for giving us the bad news. Hopefully, I can give a bit of the good news. So yeah, wanted to talk a bit about tone at the top. Now, this is a term which was obviously made up by the accounting profession, the auditing profession, and really had a very narrow focus. And I certainly, when I was an auditor, thought of this as, well, what was senior management's attitude towards internal control? That's very much the way you thought about it. Whereas I think today that term's broadened, and it's very much now thinking about, well, what's the culture of the organisation? What does that really mean? How are things done? And how does the tone of the senior management filter down through the rest of the organisation? So we're very much thinking about it being kind of both, is leadership effective? And what does effective leadership look like? And how does that impact on the culture and hence the performance of an organisation? So that's what we're really thinking about. And certainly, why we thought it was interesting to talk about here is that our profession is certainly under some scrutiny at the moment, and certainly audit is certainly under some scrutiny. And if we think about some of the latest corporate scandals, there's just a few of them here for you to peruse. I find it very interesting that almost every single time a corporate scandal hits the news, you read a little bit further and there'll be an issue of culture, there'll be an issue of leadership. Carillion, we're thinking about a poor attitude towards risk and some financial dodgy dealing, I guess. RBS, very much an aggressive culture, world domination perhaps. Even Tesco, the accounting scandal of a couple of years ago, looking a little bit deeper into the culture, the pressure on staff to always be number one supermarket. BHS, Philip Green, need we say more? And Patisserie Valerie. Now we're all very interested in the cash at bank there. How on earth did that go wrong? But actually, Luke Johnson, who is a very well respected entrepreneur and business angel, as opposed to perhaps some of the other corporate leaders who've fallen foul. Although he's held in very high regard, apparently the culture was that people would want to disappoint him, would want to live up to his standards. And there is some pieces that have been written to say, well, actually, he just had too much to do, too many businesses to look after, and perhaps took his eye off the ball. So as every time there's some sort of fault of leadership seeping through to culture. And well, why is this important to practice? Well, I think it's important, in fact, for any business. For practice in particular, there's two aspects. One, it's something you really have to pay attention to because your practice assurance obligations insist that you do. But two, there's a real commercial benefit to doing that. So just to very briefly touch on those points. Thinking about practice assurance first of all. So if we think about the practice assurance obligations, this is from the ICAEW and the Code of Ethics, just as an example here, was Standard 3, I believe it is. Pete will correct me there if I'm wrong. Talks about the need to demonstrate competence. Now, how do you demonstrate competence in your practice? Well, you need to make sure your staff are trained, that you and your staff undertake appropriate CPD. You need to make sure your firm's appropriately resourced. Standard 4, I believe it is, talks about assuring quality control through organisation, through supervision, through review. So these are areas that even if you're not a firm that does audit, you have to pay attention to, and you'd have to demonstrate during one of your QAD visits, your quality assurance visits. If you're a firm that audits, then you ought to be aware of International Education Standard 8. Now, this is something that started to come into play in July 2016. And actually what it's doing is setting out a competency framework for engagement partners, responsible individuals, RIs. And these very useful list of competence in terms of technical competence, in terms of professional skills also, and in terms of professional values, ethics and attitudes. Now, if you've just applied to be an RI, since then, you'll probably be well aware of the competencies you're expected to demonstrate. And in fact, the list is an example here of how the list sets out those competencies. But what's also interesting is that if you were already an RI, then the standard expects you to demonstrate through your CPD that you're on the ball with all of these competencies. Now, different institutes have different approaches to CPD. Certainly the ICAEW uses this approach of RAID, where you're expected to reflect on your needs, plan CPD, consider the impact, and then declare. Now, IS8 is going to need you to actually demonstrate that you've done that in relation to the professional competencies that it outlines. And just as an example here, we can look at the professional skills competencies, and if we hone in here on the personal competencies, then you're asked to make sure that you are promoting and undertaking lifelong learning, that you act as a role model to the engagement team, that you act as a mentor or a coach to the engagement team. So very much around leadership, around positive and strong culture. So a really important area for firms. But there's a real commercial impact here as well. Certainly, if your leadership is ineffective, if culture there's a problem there, then what's going to happen? Well, you're going to lose staff. You maybe therefore you're going to lose clients. You're certainly going to be missing opportunities if this isn't an area currently highlighted, I think, within your practice. And when we talk about this, about positive culture, about effective leadership, one of the questions we often get asked when we're having a discussion is, well, okay, well, that's great, but what does it actually look like? What does a positive culture actually look like? Give me something tangible. And there's a couple of things I'll share with you here. I rather like this visual of if you like, an umbrella, where strong leadership acts as that umbrella over the team, and allows the team to build resilience in the face of external pressure. And that's something that we've got to, certainly when we think about ethics, something that needs to be really very important to us in our role. We need to be able to stand firm. Thinking back to the disciplinaries Pete was referring to earlier on, we need to be very well aware of what our ethical or professional standpoint is. We need to be able to build that resilience. The other thing that I think is very useful to look at is a series of pointers. This came out, in fact, from research from the Hay Group. And this was done over about 60 years, thousands of different organisations of different size, where they looked at, well, what is it that makes a strong and positive culture or climate within an organisation or a team? Now, we're all very keen on checklists. Love a checklist, and I think this gives us a useful one. So are these things that you are aware of within your firm, or if you're a leader that you're setting for your team? Clarity. Is everybody clear on the firm's direction and purpose? Standards. Well, we need to always aim for improved standards. We've got a huge amount of professional standards, as we said, that we need to abide by. Is everybody clear as to what they are? But is there an element of flexibility? Too many rules, and then people stop taking responsibility for their own actions. So people are aware of the standards and what's expected of them, and they can take their own accountability, if you like, for their actions. Are people rewarded? And I don't just mean financially here. I mean in terms of recognition for their efforts, and their shout out, if you like, for jobs well done. And is there a real commitment to the team, a pride and a trust in the firm? I think these 6 areas are something that you can just give some thought to. I mean, well, is this existing within our firm? Is there more work that we can do? I think in a changing environment, it's something that's incredibly important. Firms, perhaps there's a number of firm mergers going on at the moment, different ways of working, impact of technology, as Pete was saying. So we're in a very dynamic place at the moment, and this is something I think we should really be paying attention to, not only because you have to under practice assurance, but actually because there's some real commercial benefit as well. Okay, so just a few points there to touch on in terms of leadership and climate. We're going to think now about managing risk, and in fact, I'm going to hand back over to Pete to chat over a few things there. Pete. Okay.
Thanks, Nikki. That's great. Some really interesting insights there. I guess the thing that occurs to me from what you just said is, number one, if the practice is evolving, it's evolving that sort of culture, isn't it, and the actual elements of that model. I think as well, I'm in lots of firms all the time, and I feel, a lot of the partners I speak to are very much knee-deep in client-facing work, and it's actually having the headspace, I guess, to think about some of those bigger issues. But some really good insights there. Thank you for that. Just before I get into this next slot, I wanted to just quickly mention for the few people that came into the webinar slightly late that we have got a Q&A box there you'll see on the screen. So if you do have any questions you want us to raise or cover off at the end of the session, do pop those questions into the Q&A box and we'll come on to them right at the end. Okay, so managing risk. What I want to talk a little bit, if I could, here in this section is thinking about maybe what you might consider to be a sort of an end-to-end process in terms of managing risk in terms of the client relationship. Again, probably focusing more on the sort of the more harder regulatory side of things, but again, hopefully equally important in the context of running a 21st century practice. I'm going to talk really about it in terms of 5 steps, really, and here's the first 3. Manage risk before acting, get the contractual terms right, and work to a high standard. So I guess just in terms of client take-on, one document I've made reference to in the reading list that accompanies the webinar is a really good publication which the ICW put out in the middle of last year called Practice Assurance Principles 2018. It's a really good publication talking about some of the sort of the issues that cropped up on their regulatory visits from a practice assurance point of view the year before. And it just seems that they put a really big focus in that particular paper on client take-on procedures. It's an area they looked at in quite a lot of detail. So I think in terms of the whole client take-on element, you do a lot worse than having a look at that paper. It's really, really very good indeed. If I just sort of pick up on a couple of themes, really, we always talk, don't we, in the context of anti-money laundering. Why us? Why is someone approaching you to provide services to them if they are, miles and miles away from where they actually operate? Are they asking you to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do? There's a generally recognised view, and has, I think, been for many a long year, that what hardened criminals will do is they'll spread their advisors far and wide so as not to draw attention to their illicit activities. And a rather depressing observation in the Treasury's 2017 National Money Laundering Risk Assessment paper was that what hardened criminals will do is they'll actively seek out reputable firms of accountants because they will attach credibility to what they do. So I think in that context, the take-on element is really, really key. And yeah, one of the observations in the paper, which I've talked about a lot over the years, I think is quite an interesting one, is if you do have sort of staff taking on new clients, not allowing a new client code to be opened up until the relevant appropriate take-on procedures and within that AML procedures have been appropriately applied, puts the firm in a much better place, really, I guess, in terms of managing risk. Getting contractual terms right, I guess we do find that on the practice regulation sessions that we run, people do really feel that letters of engagement are a real chore. I mean, if you do gravitate towards the templates of the professional body, they just seem to go on forever. But I guess it's worth remembering that in the context of a situation whereby maybe your firm has a PI claim, or maybe your firm has a complaint made against it, made perhaps to the professional body, the very, very first port of call in terms of that complaint will very much be, what did your letter of engagement say that you were going to do? And what I'm always very keen to emphasise on these sort of sessions is the importance of scope creep. So the services that you're providing to your client are evolving. Make sure that you do evolve your letter of engagement to actually reflect that fact. It'll just put you and your client in a really good place. So it's making sure letters of engagement make really clear what you are doing, and also what you're not doing for the client, and getting the appropriate wording, framed as a result. Something else which, again, we don't talk a lot about, there's been quite a lot, I think, about in the accounting press recently, has been the merits of limitation of liability clauses within letters of engagement. I've read a couple of quite interesting articles recently that have really been commending the merits of those particular clauses, but also talking about the fact that if you're going to actually have one of those limitation of liability clauses enforceable, it's got to, number one, be reasonable, and number two, got to be communicated. And one article, again, I put a link to one or two of these in the reading list that accompanies the webinar, is saying that if you bury your limitation of liability agreement away in your terms and conditions, and it's not therefore really transparent and visible to the client, and therefore not necessarily agreed by them, that will then make that limitation of liability clause less enforceable in the court of law. So I think that's the key thing. It's being willing to embrace it, but then being willing to think about it being reasonable, getting the client to very much buy into it, and then making it appropriately clear in the letter of engagement that it's there. And in that context, then you're going to be in a better place. I do appreciate that sometimes letters of engagement can be hard to get clients to sign. I mean, certainly in terms of some of the consultancy work that we do in our practice, we do quite often say, given it's quite burdensome to get the client to sign the letter of engagement, we'll issue them terms and say, well, unless you write to the contrary back to us, we'll assume that you agree. I've heard a number of speakers recently and read a number of articles recently said that if you don't get the client to actually sign to agree those terms, they're going to be less likely enforceable in a court of law. So that, again, is maybe, balancing the need to get yourself sorted out with letters of engagement and get it away with, unless you do that right, if push comes to shove and there is ever any complaint or any comeback, if they physically signed it, that's going to put you in a much, much better place. So again, some food for thought there again in relation to the way that whole process would actually work. Work to a high standard. I guess one thing I just pick up on there, quality control. I suppose it's thinking about what is your procedures in your firms if you do have staff undertake professional work for you. I know if you're a sole practitioner, you may not do that so much, but I know a lot of people here today will have staff doing work for them. What's your procedure for quality control review? I remember once meeting a firm on a review visit, and they said that, yeah, our process is very much oriented towards quality control and partners inputting and reviewing and providing feedback on work. Because if any staff need help and feedback, they will ask for it. My feedback on that was, it's the quiet ones you want to watch for. And actually, should you be as a partner or a manager, really pushing to get involved in looking at the work of other staff that aren't quite so vocal, that whole procedure is obviously quite key, but equally balancing the fact that as a partner or manager in a busy practice, you can't necessarily review every piece of professional work done or every letter that goes out the door, but it's maybe having a protocol procedure there, which again, if you're very busy with client-facing work, having the time to put that protocol in place sometimes I do appreciate can be quite tricky. And the don't get pushed around is quite simply saying, do be careful with clients putting you under pressure to do stuff late in the day. I mean, whether that's audit or any other sort of professional assignment you're undertaking. If we do audit call file reviews, we always look at the closeout meeting minutes with a particularly critical eye where the audit report's being signed right up against the final deadline for the accounts. Because the situation can arise there if the client closure occurred in that particular meeting. The temptation, because you're very much oriented towards providing a good client service, is to roll over and do what they do to get the account signed in a way timely. Sometimes, to put yourself in a better place from a risk point of view, it's delaying signing and taking the time to really understand the proposition and make sure that you get it right. So don't get pushed around late in the day, I think, is a theme I've seen a lot over the years, not only in relation to audit, but in relation to other work that firms do for clients in addition. Orderly file. So yeah, I think the key thing we're always mindful of is the importance of relevant file notes, because if there is ever any comeback, then there's something on the part to document your thought process. I guess in the context of the audit reviews that we do and the practice regulation reviews that we do more generally for firms, it's very often not that you've not tackled things in the right way, but that you've not put it on the page. And I do think as well, partners are always very good at producing file notes. If that's you, take someone along to carry your bags and get them to do the file notes of the meeting and the aspects discussed, and then it's captured there for posterity in the case of there ever being any comeback. And that's a key element, I think, of the orderly file and what that would look like. And I guess just finally, firms do get PI claims. Know at what point to involve PI insurers, have a process, make sure that your fellow managers and partners are on board and know what that process looks like. But when it comes to that particular process, do bear in mind that what will be really key, as I've already alluded to, is what your letter of engagement said that you would do, which goes back to the point I mentioned a few minutes ago. So I think that's a kind of a 5-step approach. A lot of it will be stuff you're doing already, but I think a bit of info there for hopefully in 1 or 2 respects in addition. Before I hand back to Nikki, very quickly, a couple of just final things to mention in brief. So we are asked occasionally to do compliance reviews of firms in relation to practice assurance work more generally, as well as audit. Excuse me. And this is some of the kind of stuff that we're often looking for, in the files that we review. Not that we would in any way, shape or form be providing feedback on the technical aspects of tax work undertaken. It's all about procedure. It's all about workflow. I read quite an interesting article which was in Economia a couple of months ago, and I'm going to put a link to this in the notes, around where PI claims crop up most commonly. It was, I think, put out by Bluefin, the insurance broker. They said that the number one area for claims tends to be around what they call general accountancy work, and that's probably about accountants not doing things for clients in terms of VAT registration, R&D claims, tax returns in the required timescale. So if you've got a good process to track workflow, it means you will hit those deadlines timely, and that obviously is very key. If you've got a very robust practice management system, you'll be all over that. But interestingly, yes, that's one area where there has been issues, I think, which is why I was quite keen to mention that here today. And finally, I'm not going to make a lot more of a play about AML. I've talked about it quite a bit in this session this afternoon. Very good paper there you'll find on the CCAB website, all about some really good practical case studies about the issues that firms face in the 21st century in relation to how hardened criminals and fraudsters will basically dupe folk in firms to do things they shouldn't be doing. And again, you might be all over AML, but if you were to share some of those findings with your staff, you'd be doing a good thing. So again, do be aware of that as well in relation to the complementary materials supplementing today's webinar session. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Nikki now. I'm going to finish off by talking about some other aspects in relation to managing people before I rather randomly lose my voice completely. Okay, Nikki, over to you.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you. My voice in a minute because I haven't started the microphone up. So there we go. Thanks very much for that. So I have a little slot here on managing people, and I guess we're picking up on a few of those aspects that Pete was referring to in terms of, make sure you might be aware of this, but are your staff? Thinking about the different roles that people play within your firm. Now, clearly, managing people is a very big topic, and one that I'm going to do probably very little justice to in about the 7 minutes that we have left. So forgive me. I'm just kind of, I guess we thought it was really important to include here. I'm going to touch on some aspects that we think are interesting and that firms should be thinking about, and that firms have been discussing with us on the various elements. Now, I guess the first thing that we need to say is people management is hard. It's time consuming. It can be frustrating at times. Why bother? A classic quote, this one, and interestingly, it's meant to be between a chief financial officer and a CEO, with the value for money CFO saying, well, what happens if we train people and they leave? And the CEO saying, well, yeah, okay, but what happens if we don't train them and they stay? Which I think is just the absolute, clear reason for needing to put some time and thought into people development. And in the context of what we're saying here, the modern accountant, just a few visuals here, which I found amusing. The old John Cleese image of an accountant there. We're moving away from this. Well, why are we moving away from it? Well, we want to, for a start, but we have to, because actually the more boring aspect of our lives in the future apparently are going to be taken over by robots. So there's not going to be need for the number cruncher in quite the same way anymore. So if we're to have a future at all, if firms are to have a future at all in the 21st century, we need to turn them into these rather smart-looking people here, but the trusted business advisor that Pete was talking about earlier. We can then go ahead and save the world. So, a vitally important area for us. Now, how do we go about that? What are the skills needed? Now, one of the things I think is incredibly useful and you'd be aware of if you train students is the professional bodies. This is an example for ICAW, but all of the professional bodies will have one of these. Will have a professional skills development ladder. In fact, they call it in ACA. It may be a competency framework in some of the other bodies. It may be something to do with perhaps AAT and the apprenticeship framework. There's a really, really useful checklist there of a little tiny here on the screen, but I've put a link to it in the reading list actually. But a checklist of the sorts of skills, the sort of things that people need to be able to do. And it gives you a really good framework to be able to say, okay, well, how can I make sure that people are learning the things I need them to learn to be the business advisor of the future? Go to those checklists. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that particular side at the moment, but just to reiterate something that Pete said earlier, what is sure is that the people in firms today are going to follow a very different path than perhaps you followed and I followed, because some of those jobs that perhaps the receipts in a brown bag or certain manual work done today that's going to be computerized, making tax digital, for example, is going to take an awful lot of the kind of sifting through paperwork away. And that's going to mean that, we lose a bit of the development for people. Social media and electronic means of communication means that people have less opportunity to practice sometimes their interpersonal communication skills. So actually we need to really think about, okay, if people are going through a different route than me, how are they going to develop the skills that perhaps you already have in terms of being that business advisor? Now, one of the things that we often use, I'm in massive detail here, but one of the things we often use when we're running workshops on development of people, something called the skill wheel matrix, and it's very useful for thinking about your leadership style also. And we're thinking about where people are in terms of their ability, so their skill, and their motivation, so their will. So when people, perhaps start, they might be very very lacking in knowledge. They might be a bit hesitant, or they might in fact be keen as mustard and sometimes a bit of a loose cannon. Occasionally people, as they progress, maybe become very skilled, but they might become a bit bored and perhaps demotivated. The different management styles and different development opportunities are appropriate at different stages. And things that you can think about, certainly a directive approach can be very, very useful when somebody's new. But actually, if somebody is going to hone their skills, you need to not just tell them all of the time. You need to support them. You need to guide them. Ultimately, you need to think about coaching and actually empower people to get out there and perhaps, dare we say it, make a mistake or two, but thinking about the kind of the umbrella in terms of the support that you might be able to give them. And people need to be motivated, particularly those people who perhaps are skilled, but dare I say it, a bit bored. What's key to this? Well, Pete mentioned it earlier, and it's everybody's favourite. It's the need for feedback. And we find that people find feedback tough. Feedback, sometimes, especially constructive feedback, it can be, a little bit difficult to give. We were dealing with a firm, speaking to a firm just recently, where there was a trainee who was not going to be kept on at the end of their probation period. And it turned out that this trainee really had very little idea that this was going to be the case, because he'd been getting very, very little feedback throughout the 6 months that he'd actually been working for the firm. People had shied away from giving him the bad news, and instead had taken work that was incomplete and finished it, or taken work that was wrong and corrected it. and everybody then felt very uncomfortable about the situation, and it would have been far better if feedback had been given a little bit more timely. Three-step model that we find helps. Number one, try to be factual, be accurate, and actually tell people, give people the example of the piece of work that you're feeding back on. Secondly, tell them what the effect is on you or on the client. Don't try and get inside their head. And thirdly, talk about the change that you need. And EEC, sometimes I refer to this three-step model, can really help you construct a piece of feedback that can be quite accurate, not personal. Now, it's also worth saying that, typically feedback always comes from a good place. So actually kind of embracing that and practice, making sure that you are developing a feedback culture, a coaching culture in your organisation, absolutely critical if we're to prevent some of the disciplinaries, some of the PI claims, some of the bad news that unfortunately Pete's been talking about today. Absolutely vital. So I absolutely haven't done justice to people management in 8 minutes. In fact, I've taken there, and that wasn't my intention. But just a flavour of some things we thought that were relevant to bring up, and that people should perhaps be thinking about. So thanks very much for your attention. I know that we're pushing on to the time that we said we'd spend. So I'm going to move on and deal with any questions perhaps that people had. Pete, I don't know if you want to come back in there now. There you are. So we are both here. I'm usually in the same room actually for now. So any questions you had? There was one that popped up earlier that I'll take, that I saw, which was about thinking about culture and climate. And actually, very interesting point was around flexible working. And it's a conversation we had quite recently actually about how it can be quite hard if people work mainly from home, to actually really think about how the team culture is working. And I think that's a really excellent point. I think that change in working practice is a really good example of why we need to pay it attention. I think it's actually that even when people do work at home, and if you are somebody perhaps who takes advantage of flexible working as well, I think you have to just much more consciously make sure that you do connect in with other colleagues. That if you think about those 6 key areas that Hay pointed out in terms of clarity and standards, accountability, and so on. Are you connecting in with other people in your firm? Are you clear about the direction, for example? And are you sure that people who work for you are also? I think at the end of the day as well, at some point, face-to-face contact is always worth it. Whether that's just a weekly thing. I think people need to strive to get some team dynamics going there. Certainly, Pete, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, there's one I'll just pick up on actually, which is we talked a bit about sort of the sort of PI cover and claims and liability limitation clauses. And just one here about where would you kind of pitch sort of a level of limitation of liability. Do have a look at some of the resources in the reading list. I find that quite insightful actually, having not given it a huge amount of thought over the years. But again, just the sort of the theme seemed to be that it's all about that particular agreement being agreed with the client. So it's about it being very transparent. I guess a bit like some of the stuff we talk about in terms of GDPR in that sense. Multiples of fees, it seems, are not always easily enforceable. The fee times 5, times 10, times 20, whatever it might be. I think it seems from what I've picked up on that it might often be that firms would link the liability cap to their PI cover. That might be a way to go. The other thing you'll pick up on in the article I put in the notes there is that don't underestimate how big a claim can be. You might be in a situation where you think, in fact, we're doing fairly mundane stuff here. We'd never have a claim, but actually, I think certainly in terms of tax related stuff, claims can be really quite high if you've not come across the experience before. So being mindful of that, I suppose, when you are framing, that sort of agreement. But transparency, I think, is key. But some of the resources in the notes may well provide you with some more guidance there.
Okay. I think we're certainly perhaps done on our time there. I don't know if there are any other questions that have come in, or if anybody has any comments. Very, very pleased to hear them, if that's the case. But otherwise, I just like to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Really appreciate it. We'd be really interested in hearing your feedback, comments, questions. And there's a feedback form, in fact, that you can access. You can access there. And thank you very much. That's been great. Thank you.